Assalamu alaikum. Welcome everyone to our physiology discussion. Today's discussion basically on the cardiovascular system. One, the blood flow through the heart. Previous class we have already discussed a little bit about the blood flow through the heart. But this class I am going to present you additional information about the blood flow through the heart. We know that the heart is a central pumping machine. That means my heart works through continuously being pumping. Look at that. The pumping is process heart expand, contract, expand, contract. So this pumping is actually achieved by combination of two process. One is systole and others one is diastole. That means heart pumping through the combination of systole and diastole movement of its four chambers. At the same time, two upper chambers get diastole, two lower chambers get systole. This is the continuous process. Now, the blood flow through the heart is actually one-way movement of flow. Look at that. In case of left side, the oxygenated blood from the lungs comes to the heart. That means left atrium. Then the blood comes to the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle the blood goes to the aorta, and from the aorta the blood distributed to the whole body. That means out of the heart. This is the one-way movement of blood flow. In case of right side, look at that. The blood from the outer part of the heart comes to the right atrium. From the right atrium, the blood goes to the right ventricle, and from the right ventricle, the blood goes to the blood vessels, pulmonary artery, and it distributed to the our two lungs. That means out of the heart. This is the one-way movement of blood flow. The heart actually works through the continuous pumping. That means the systole at a time of ventricle, diastole at a time of atrium. Firstly, during the atrial systole, diastole, atrial diastole, that means the chamber of our upper chambers, this left atrium, this right atrium, get expand, and the volume of this chamber get increase. So the oxygenated blood from the lungs comes to the left atrium through the four pulmonary veins. Here the two are prominent and two are indirectly. From the right lungs comes to the left atrium. After the finishing of diastole of atria, the left atrium is filled up with oxygenated blood. Now the atrial systole started. Atrial systole started. During the atrial systole, the volume of this atria get decreased because the upper wall put a downward pressure, this side wall put a inward pressure. That means the volume get decreased. So this atrium put a pressure to the bicuspid valve. That means it is called the atrial kick, because this put a pressure to the bicuspid valve. It is called the atrial kick. Now this is the oxygenated blood and this is the bicuspid valve. Here the oxygenated blood in the upper chambers If the upper chambers put a pressure to the bicuspid valve, the valves get downway and the blood goes to the left ventricle. Now the blood here into the left ventricle and the finishing of atrial systole, atrial diastole. If the blood comes to the left ventricle, then it's started ventricular diastole, systole. Sorry, a ventricular systole, ventricular systole. During the ventricular systole, the ventricle get contract. That means this side wall put a pressure, inward pressure, this wall put a upward pressure, and this septum put a inward pressure. So it is actually called the cardiac twist. That means this chamber get twisted. So it is called the cardiac twist. Now, if the volume of this ventricle get decrease, it blood pressure and the ventricular pressure get increase, and it puts a pressure to the two valves, bicuspid valves and this aortic semilunar valve. Now look at that. In case of bicuspid valve, here the valve in open position. Now if the ventricle put a pressure to the bicuspid valve, that means upward pressure, the valves get closed, get closed, get closed. It's actually called the slam shot. And look at that. In case of aortic semilunar valve, the valves are in closed position. If the ventricle put a pressure to this valve, the valve get open, open, open. So the blood from the ventricle goes to the aorta during the ventricular systole. Now the blood from the aorta try to get down, because here the aortic semilunar valve open now, and this time these valves get open, and after the finishing of ventricular systole, this ventricle and its wall get relaxed. So here the aortic semilunar valve now in open position, it get close, get close, get close. So it prevent the regurgitation flow of blood to the aorta to ventricle. Look at that. At the same time, these valves and these valves prevent the regurgitation flow of blood. That means ventricle to atria, and that means aorta to ventricle. This is the regurgitation flow of blood. It is prevented by these two valves. In case of right side, a valve deoxygenated blood, that means partly deoxygenated blood, comes to the right atrium during the atrial diastole, and this chamber is filled up with deoxygenated blood. Then the atrial systole happened, so this atrium put a atrial kick to the tricuspid valve, and the blood easily goes to the right ventricle during the atrial systole. If the atrial systole completed, it started ventricular systole. During the ventricular systole, this ventricle put a upward pressure to the tricuspid valve. Here same process, tricuspid valve here in open position, it get closed, get closed. It called the slam shot of ventricle. At the same time, this ventricle put a pressure to the pulmonary semilunar valve. Here the pulmonary semilunar valve. Here it is now in closed position. If the ventricle put a upward pressure, it get open, open. So the deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle get to the pulmonary artery and it distributed to the two lungs. And from the pulmonary artery, the deoxygenated blood try to get down. That means it also called the regurgitation blood flow. Now this valve are in open position, it get closed. So it prevent the regurgitation flow of blood. Now look at that. These valves are bicuspid and tricuspid valves. During the ventricular systole, the ventricle put a upward pressure to the bicuspid valves and tricuspid valves. That means both valves are open position. The ventricle put a upward pressure. The valves are closed. This is called a lub. This is called lub. And the ventricle also put a pressure to the aortic semilunar valve to get open. If the both valves is open position, after finishing of ventricular systole, the both valves get down. That means closed. This is called the dub. So this is the combination of lub dub is actually called the heart sound. Look at that. This is lub, this is dub. This is lub, this is dub. Lub dub is a heart sound. Now look at that. The both chamber, that means atrium, left atrium and left ventricle. The blood, oxygenated blood is drained into the left atrium. Deoxygenated blood is drained into the right atrium. So it is the receiving chamber. That means it receives blood. So atria are receiving chamber. And look at that, both ventricle, from the ventricle it distributed oxygenated blood to the whole body, and from this ventricle it distributed deoxygenated blood to the our two lungs. So it is called the distributing chamber. So ventricle are the distributing chamber. So this is the whole of blood flow through the heart. Thank you everyone.